Well, friends, picture this with me. It's the 1st of October 2025. The marble halls of the United Nations in New York City, usually filled with polite speeches and endless jargon, suddenly trembled under the weight of words sharper than any weapon. A young president, not from one of the world's mighty powers, but from a small landlocked nation, Burkina Faso, rose to his feet. He wore no polished suit, no golden tie. Instead, he stood in his soldier's jacket, a reminder that his journey came not from privilege, but from the battlefield. He fixed his eyes on the guardians of global finance, the International Monetary Fund, and with a steady voice declared, "Africa owes you nothing." It was as if David had pointed his finger at Goliath not with a stone, but with truth. And in that moment, silence cracked across the chamber before thunderous applause erupted from African delegations. IMF officials sat frozen, their silence heavier than words. For many watching, it was a déjà vu of history itself, a voice echoing the defiance of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's legendary leader, who once dared to confront the same powers before being silenced forever. But this time, history did not belong to the past. It was alive again, breathing in the voice of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. And so, I ask you, is this the spark of a new African awakening, a revolution of dignity and independence, or is it a dangerous gamble, one that could lead to hunger, retaliation, and the crushing hand of global power? Before we dive into the full story, his accusations, the reaction across Africa, and the world's uneasy silence, pause for a moment. If you were in that chamber, would you have joined the applause, or would you have kept your hands still? If you believe Africa's fight for dignity deserves to be heard, stay with us. Please share this video so that others may understand what truly happened, and subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than headlines. On the morning of October 1st, 2025, the United Nations chamber in New York was dressed in its usual solemnity. Flags of the world lined the marble walls, delegates shuffled papers, and the agenda announced a routine debate on debt restructuring. But everyone inside the hall knew better. The air was heavy with expectation because the word Africa was silently stamped on every line of the day's discussion. Seated near the front was Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional president of Burkina Faso. To some, he was a curiosity, a soldier turned statesman barely in his late 30s. To others, he was a threat, a man whose voice had already unsettled the guardians of the global order. Unlike the diplomats and presidents in their perfectly tailored suits, Traoré wore a plain military jacket. It was not fashion, it was a statement. He came not as a polished politician, but as a soldier who had risen from the dust of battlefields, representing millions whose lives had been shaped by poverty and conflict. When the chairman introduced the session, Traoré stood slowly. His movements were deliberate, his gaze steady. He unfolded a sheet of paper, but before looking down, he raised his head and stared directly at the officials of the International Monetary Fund seated across the hall. The tension was palpable. Delegates leaned forward, cameras adjusted, and then with a voice both calm and fierce, he began, "Africa owes you nothing. It is you who owe us the truth." The words struck like thunder. For decades, African leaders had stood in this same hall, making careful appeals for debt relief, negotiating for aid, asking for mercy. But this was not a plea. This was an indictment. He called it the 7 crimes of the IMF in West Africa. One by one, he laid them out, each accusation more devastating than the last. First, he spoke of Ghana and Ivory Coast, 2 nations locked in endless debt traps. Ghana, he reminded the Assembly, had taken a $3 billion bailout in 2022 and still carried obligations worth over $2.7 billion in special drawing rights to the IMF. Instead of building schools or hospitals, billions were leaving the country each year in interest payments. Ivory Coast, too, had mortgaged its future chained to creditors who dictated its path. Second, he denounced the forced privatization of Ghana's cocoa industry. Once the pride of the nation, sustaining millions of farmers' cocoa, had been handed to foreign corporations under IMF guidance. Farmers were left with crumbs while profits flowed overseas. Third, his voice sharpened as he described the savage cuts to health and education budgets in Mali and Senegal. IMF loan conditions had demanded austerity. The result, children went hungry and hospitals crumbled for lack of resources. Fourth, he turned to Nigeria, recalling the devastating devaluation of the naira in 1986 carried out under IMF supervision. Overnight, the middle class collapsed, inflation devoured wages, and millions were driven into poverty. Fifth, he pointed to Liberia and Sierra Leone, where IMF loans flowed despite governments crippled by corruption. Ordinary citizens never saw the benefits. They inherited debt, but no progress. Sixth, he came to his own homeland, Burkina Faso. IMF advice had pushed the country to export raw gold instead of refining it at home. The outcome was inevitable. Multinationals grew richer, while Burkinabe miners remained poor, their land stripped of treasure. Seventh, he ended with Niger, where IMF policies forced the privatization of electricity and telecommunications. Strategic industries were sold off to foreign investors, leaving the country without control over its most vital sectors. The chamber grew heavier with each charge. Delegates shifted uncomfortably. IMF officials stared at their papers, refusing to look up. The accusations were not technical, not hidden in jargon. They were human, painted in hunger-broken hospitals, stolen industries, and lost sovereignty. And then came his most piercing line. This is not about money. This is about honor, about the dignity of Africa. For a long second, silence hung like a storm cloud over the hall. It felt as if the world itself had stopped to listen. Then suddenly, applause erupted. African delegations stood, their hands thundering in defiance, echoing his words through the chamber. But in the IMF's row, silence remained cold, immovable, louder than any rebuttal. That morning, the routine debate on debt had turned into something else. It was no longer about restructuring contracts or shifting numbers. It was about justice. It was about whether Africa would continue to kneel or whether for the first time in generations it would rise and say, "We owe you nothing." The words had barely left his mouth when the chamber froze. Delegates held their breath, cameras zoomed in, and the officials of the IMF sat stiff, staring down at their notes as if they could disappear into the paper. For a heartbeat, the room felt like a cathedral suspended in silence. And then applause. It began with a ripple from the African delegations. Then it grew wave after wave until it rolled through the chamber like thunder. Representatives from Mali, Niger, and Guinea stood to clap. Some smiled openly, others nodded with solemn approval. Their hands, their voices declared that what had just been spoken was not merely a speech, but a truth long buried. Yet across the aisle, IMF representatives sat unmoved, their silence heavier than stone. That silence for many was louder than the applause. It was the silence of guilt. The moment did not end in that room. Within minutes, the words "Africa owes you nothing" spread like wildfire across the continent. Radios crackled in villages from Mali to Ghana. Television screens replayed the clip in Dakar and Accra. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in cafes and markets, raising their fists when Traore's voice echoed through old speakers. A cocoa farmer in Ghana wiped tears from his eyes and whispered, "At last someone speaks for us." In a dusty Malian village, mothers huddled around a radio, their children silent, listening to words they thought they would never hear in their lifetime. In the capital of Burkina Faso, murals appeared overnight. By dawn, walls in Ouagadougou bore the painted faces of Ibrahim Traoré beside Thomas Sankara, two soldier presidents bound across decades by the same defiance. Young artists used their brushes as weapons, proclaiming a continuation of a struggle older than themselves. Commentators across Africa did not hold back. In Accra, a journalist reminded viewers of Ghana's crushing $7 billion IMF debt, demanding, "How can a nation that feeds the world with cocoa remain shackled?" In Lagos, scholars phoned into late-night radio programs declaring, "He speaks for us all." Social media across the continent lit up with hashtags, "Night dignity, not debt, night Africa owes nothing." But it was not only Africa that listened. Thousands of miles away in the United States, the African diaspora felt a tremor of pride. At Howard University in Washington, professors gathered students to rewatch the speech, comparing Traoré's defiance with the words of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, even Frederick Douglass. In Harlem, pastors invoked his line, "This is about dignity, not money," as scripture in Sunday sermons. In Atlanta, choirs wove his words into hymns of freedom. For the first time in years, Africa was not on American television as a victim of famine or war, but as a voice of defiance, a force demanding respect. The reactions among governments, however, were far more divided. In Washington, the State Department issued a statement calling the remarks reckless, warning that such rhetoric could destabilize an already fragile Sahel. In Paris, commentators on late-night television dismissed Traoré's words as dangerously nationalistic. In Brussels, officials urged restraint and continued cooperation with global financial institutions, though their tone betrayed unease. To question the IMF so openly was to shake the very pillars of the world order. Meanwhile, Moscow and Beijing seized the moment. Russian media hailed Traore as a revolutionary heir to Africa's anti-colonial heroes. Chinese outlets highlighted their no-strings infrastructure loans, contrasting them with IMF austerity demands, and suggested that Africa's future lay in choosing new partners. Back in Africa, the energy was intoxicating but laced with fear. Analysts warned on local television that the IMF could retaliate, cutting aid, tightening credit, raising interest rates. Aid agencies quietly cautioned that food programs might shrink. The defiance was exhilarating, but its price could be hunger. Still, ordinary citizens did not bend. Market women in Ouagadougou declared they would endure hardship if it meant freedom. Teachers unpaid for months wrote Traore's words on classroom chalkboards. This is about dignity, not money. Soldiers at checkpoints repeated the phrase like a prayer. Across West Africa, dignity was no longer a slogan. It had become a vow. And so the chamber's silence grew into a storm outside its walls. The IMF's stillness in New York became a roar in Africa's streets. What began as one man's defiance was quickly transforming into a collective movement, stretching across borders, oceans, and generations. The question now was no longer what he said, but what Africa would do next. In the days that followed, the echo of Ibrahim Traoré's words did not fade, it multiplied. Across Burkina Faso, ordinary people carried his declaration into their daily lives as though it had been etched into the very soil. Teachers, long weary of empty paychecks, wrote on blackboards for their students to read, "This is about dignity, not money." Mothers whispered the phrase as a kind of blessing to their children at bedtime. Soldiers at dusty roadside checkpoints greeted travelers not with suspicion, but with pride, murmuring, "We owe nothing." For the first time in decades, ordinary citizens felt their leader had stood up for them on the world stage. The sense of empowerment was undeniable. In Ouagadougou, thousands filled the streets not in protest, but in celebration. Drums echoed through marketplaces, flags waved from rooftops, and young people painted slogans on walls. To them, the president's defiance was not just a speech, but a turning point in history. A market woman told a journalist, "We have been poor for generations. If poverty is the price of freedom, we will pay it." Her words captured a mood shared across the country: better to suffer with dignity than to survive in chains. But with the euphoria came shadows. Inside government halls, ministers debated urgently. Some warned that the IMF and its allies could retaliate with financial weapons more devastating than armies, cutting aid, raising interest rates, freezing credit lines. Burkina Faso's economy, already fragile, relied heavily on grain imports and fuel subsidies. If those lifelines were severed, hunger could sweep across villages and prices could spiral out of control. The question was unavoidable. Could dignity endure when the hunger bills arrived? Civil society organizations echoed the concern. Aid agencies cautioned that food programs might shrink. Economists pointed to the cold arithmetic: West Africa's average debt-to-GDP ratio already hovered above 60%. If credit was cut off, millions might face immediate hardship. The paradox was clear. The bolder the defiance, the greater the risk of suffering for ordinary citizens. Yet paradoxically, the threat seemed only to strengthen unity. University students in Ghana and Nigeria organized forums to debate alternatives to IMF loans. Young economists posted essays online calling for homegrown solutions. Activists launched rallies demanding governments reject foreign dictates. What began as applause in New York was evolving into political discourse across the continent. Within Burkina Faso itself, Traoré's speech reshaped politics overnight. Opposition figures who once criticized him cautiously voiced support, unwilling to appear aligned with the IMF. His popularity surged, murals of his face multiplying on city walls. The legacy of Thomas Sankara, once invoked in hushed tones, now re-emerged, openly binding past and present in a single thread of resistance. Internationally, however, the dangers loomed large. Investors in London and New York watched uneasily, hinting at raising borrowing costs for African nations. In Brussels and Paris, officials warned of instability. Even within Africa, some leaders worried that one nation's defiance might trigger collective punishment for all. Still, for the people of Burkina Faso, the equation had changed. They were no longer merely enduring poverty. They were enduring it with purpose. A teacher in Bobo Dioulasso told a reporter, "For years, our sacrifice meant nothing. Now at least it carries the name of dignity." In that fragile balance between hunger and hope, the seeds of a political shift were sown. Traore's defiance had not just challenged the IMF, it had transformed poverty from a burden into a battleground for honor, and in doing so, it redefined what it meant to be a citizen of Burkina Faso. If the halls of the United Nations trembled on October 1st, then the ripple it created was felt most strongly in Washington, Paris, Moscow, and Beijing. For the great powers, Ibrahim Traoré's defiance was not simply an African story, it was a challenge to the architecture of global finance itself. In the United States, the reaction was sharply divided. The State Department moved quickly to label Traoré's remarks reckless and warned that they could destabilize the already fragile Sahel. Officials reminded reporters that Burkina Faso still relied heavily on external assistance. Behind closed doors, however, the mood was more serious. For decades, Washington had used the IMF and World Bank as instruments of influence, shaping the policies of smaller nations without ever firing a shot. To see a young African president turn those institutions into the accused in front of the world was unsettling, perhaps even dangerous. Some feared it would embolden others from Ghana to Nigeria to follow suit. But beyond the walls of government, the American reaction was strikingly different. In African-American communities, Traoré's words resonated deeply. At Howard University, students debated whether his declaration was a 21st-century version of Africa's Declaration of Independence. In Harlem, pastors repeated his line, "This is about dignity, not money," as if it were scripture. Radio hosts in Atlanta compared the moment to the Boston Tea Party, a rebellion not against taxation but against financial servitude. For many, it was the first time in years that Africa's leader was on American television not as a victim of famine or war, but as a voice of defiance. The American press mirrored this divide. Mainstream outlets like the Washington Post and CNN called the speech a dangerous gamble that could isolate Africa financially. Yet smaller publications and independent commentators praised Traoré as a visionary. Talk radio lit up with callers asking a simple but explosive question. If Africa owes nothing, who then owes Africa across the Atlantic? Europe's response carried unease. In Paris, commentators dismissed Traoré's words as dangerously nationalistic. Brussels officials urged stability, but the tremor in their tone was clear. For the European Union, the IMF was not just a financial institution, it was part of the very scaffolding of global order. To see it publicly accused of crimes and to remain silent in its defense was humiliating. Meanwhile, the East seized opportunity. Russian media hailed Traoré as the heir of Africa's anti-colonial heroes, comparing him to Lumumba and Sankara. Moscow hinted at hosting a summit to explore African debt alternatives. Chinese state outlets contrasted their infrastructure loans, no strings attached, with IMF austerity positioning Beijing as Africa's true partner. In both capitals, the calculation was clear: if Africa turned away from Washington and Paris, new doors could open toward Moscow and Beijing. Finally, in Addis Ababa, the African Union convened a special session. Delegates quoted Traoré's words about dignity and honor, debating not whether to oppose the IMF but how. Proposals for an African sovereignty fund emerged, pooling resources to replace reliance on foreign loans. For the first time in decades, the vision of financial independence had a concrete institutional shape. The global divide was unmistakable. To the West, Traoré's defiance was reckless nationalism. To the East, it was opportunity. And to Africa itself, it was hope. The image is now etched in memory: a young soldier president standing tall in the marble chamber of the United Nations, pointing his finger at the guardians of global finance and declaring, "Africa owes you nothing." His words cracked through decades of silence like thunder. For a moment, the applause of African delegations rolled across the chamber, out into the streets of Ouagadougou, and into the hearts of millions far beyond Africa. But as powerful as that moment was, the struggle ahead remains daunting. Poverty will not vanish overnight. Hunger, fragile economies, and political instability still stalk the continent. And the IMF, together with its allies, may yet retaliate. Aid could shrink, loans could tighten, and sanctions could fall like an invisible siege. The courage to speak truth to power does not erase the mathematics of debt or the realities of global markets. Yet something deeper has been born. For decades, Africa's voice was muffled beneath interest payments and austerity demands. On October 1st, that silence was broken. This was not a polite request, not a negotiation. It was a declaration: dignity is not for sale. From classrooms in Burkina Faso to radio stations in Ghana, from murals in Ouagadougou to sermons in Harlem, Traoré's words have already begun to shift the consciousness of a generation. Still, we must ask ourselves, will this fire grow into a continental revolution of dignity, or will it be smothered by fear, hunger, and the heavy hand of global power? If your ancestors could hear these words today, what would they say? Would they urge compromise, or would they whisper, "Stand firm"? For Americans watching, especially those over 60 who have lived through civil rights struggles, Cold War confrontations, and economic recessions, the question is both distant and close. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies of national reform are effective enough to protect his people? Can we trust him to carry this banner forward, or will another leader need to rise in his place? This is not just about Africa. It is about all of us, about whether dignity can survive in a world run by numbers, banks, and contracts. The outcome will not be decided by Traoré alone. It will be decided by whether ordinary people from West Africa to America choose to stand with him or look away. So I invite you, if his words touched your heart, leave just one word in the comments: dignity. Let the world see that you heard him. Please share this video if you believe you are among the first to stand with President Ibrahim Traoré, and subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines. Because as Traoré himself said that day in New York, we do not ask permission to be free. We have risen to claim it.